What is up, everybody? I'm David Donnelly, and this is A Call to Minds. Today's guest is Dr. Rick Strassman. If you've seen the documentary DMT, The Spirit Molecule, or if you're a regular listener to Joe Rogan's podcast, you're probably familiar with his work, which focuses on psychedelics. For more details about this episode, including recommended reading and links, you can visit calltominds.com. Without further ado, here is my fascinating conversation with Dr. Rick Strassman.
I think that there's a couple of ways that psychedelics could help address larger questions than maybe the psychotherapy that are now being addressed in the research world. One of them could be to extend their application to other things. There were studies in the Bay Area in the 60s, early 70s, giving LSD to already creative people to see if they could solve problems that they were stuck on at the time. It wasn't just taking some man off the street to determine if he'd be more creative, but you're already working with people that are accomplished in their fields, scientifically, artistically. And those people came in with a problem they couldn't quite solve, and they got some LSD, went home, and applied the solutions that they discovered.
Wow.
So that's only been one study, and that seems like an important area.
Right.
I think another aspect of kind of enlarging the discussion about the effects or roles of psychedelics would be to look into their effects of being like a panacea. If you read the literature, they're helpful for depression, for end-of-life distress, for OCD, alcoholism, substance abuse. They increase your appreciation of nature. They make you more of an open person, the quality of openness.
Is that why microdosing is starting to become so popular? Do you think that the scientific community is finally starting to turn around a little bit on this?
Well, the microdosing effects are somewhat more subtle. Those studies demonstrating all those panacea-like effects refer to high dose or medium dose experiences. With the low doses or the microdoses, well, first of all, it's important to define microdosing.
Well, I just, just from what I've read, it's that people are starting to experiment with taking this small amount on a regular basis and substituting that for an antidepressant or some kind of other medication. So just meant to, I guess, get a small amount in the bloodstream for kind of longer-term depression and chronic mental illness.
Yeah, well, small doses can be slightly acutely active. You feel like a little buzz, maybe a little stimulation. And super small doses, you can't really discern. You really don't, know that you've taken anything. Like, for example, if you're given a tiny dose and then placebo, salt water or milk powder, you wouldn't be able to, to acutely tell the difference. So there could be, pharmacological effects in those cases where you don't really feel any acute response to the drug, like Prozac, for example.
Right.
Yeah, or it could help anxiety.
Yeah.
Or when they give antidepressants, to normal volunteers, there may be some effects on their creativity, wellness, just their general mood. So in those cases, I think those completely acutely inactive doses are acting like mostly as a psychopharmacologic agent. With the small doses that are still slightly active, I think they can enhance certain mental functions in the same way, although to a lesser extent than the more active doses. Like they'll increase your creativity, your mood acutely, your appreciation, your awareness of your body.
Is this a way that people can actually, view world problems in a different light? Or could this be applied at a much bigger level than what's happening right now?
I think they can be useful in that way, but only in a certain context.
Right.
If you look at the effects of psychedelics, that they seem to do anything you want them to do. So that seems to indicate they're having an effect on the placebo response, which means you're already primed for a response. For example, you've got asthma and you take, let's be more concrete. Let's say you're spiritually oriented in the first place, but you haven't had that big experience.
Right.
If you take some psychedelics, you'll have that big experience. 9 times out of 10 with the proper preparation, supervision, integration of the after effects. So I think if you're of the mind to improve the state of the world, as opposed to making it worse, for example, which you could take psychedelics for, like look at Charles Manson and his followers.
Yeah.
They used LSD for bad purposes, but they were already primed to do bad things. And when they took the LSD with Manson, those beliefs were just strengthened. So I think if you're into saving the world or being environmentally active or supportive of progressive political causes, then if you take LSD or psychedelics, psilocybin in the proper setting, those feelings will be enhanced. You'll be even more convinced of their importance. You'll seek out ways to implement those beliefs and feelings. You think they're truer now than you did before. So I think that they can, but whether or not they produce a paradigm shift, I think would more be in terms of the way we look at the mind and its response to suggestion and hope and fear, as opposed to it causing a paradigm shift in the larger culture, for example.
Right. You were way ahead of the game on this research.
Yeah, well, I began the paperwork for my study in 1988, and it took a couple of years to work out a system with the government to fund and approve a study like this. And one of the reasons we were funded and approved was because the study was really very basic. We wanted to see if we could give DMT to a group of experienced psychedelic users, that were otherwise psychologically, healthy, and generate valuable data. Do it safely.
Right. Could you maybe describe, just before we go further, the difference between DMT? I don't know if everyone understands the difference or define it. I mean, as opposed to the other types of psychedelics.
Yeah. Well, there's a category of drugs called the classical psychedelics that include LSD, psilocybin, mescaline, and DMT. And the DMT is found in the human body, as opposed to the other compounds. So LSD is a synthesis, or it's a compound which is made in the laboratory. It's a derivative of a mold, actually, but the compound itself is synthetic. Psilocybin is found in magic mushrooms and is probably the most popular drug being studied in the research world right now. Mescaline occurs in peyote cactus, which is used in the Native American church. And the DMT is found in plants, and it also is found in animals, including humans. So DMT stands for dimethyltryptamine. It's a chemical cousin of melatonin and of serotonin. And the reason I was interested in it was because of my questions regarding the biological bases of spiritual experience. I was thinking, well, what's this substance doing in the human brain, the human body?
Right.
This drug, so-called drug DMT. Yeah, and I was thinking if the human body produced its own psychedelic, perhaps that was involved in non-drug spiritual states or other highly altered states, even dreams, the near-death state, spiritual experiences which occur as a result of prayer meditation.
So these near-death experiences, which could be compared to a trip, right? To some extent, that's maybe, I think you made some comparisons to those, and that's what maybe led to this idea?
Yeah. I thought if you gave DMT to people and it replicated certain features of non-drug states like dreams or the near-death state, perhaps it is involved to that extent in mediating those particular effects. In other words, might it be possible that increases of naturally occurring DMT take place when these non-drug so-called states occur?
So someone almost dies and they say they saw bright lights and all of these things, and if you compare that to someone that might be taking DMT, it might be a similar thing.
Yeah, that was my theory originally. And actually, a few months ago, there was a paper published by a group at the University of Michigan, which demonstrated that brain levels of DMT increase in the dying rat brain. So that is consistent
Wow.
with theory regarding a role of DMT in at least mediating perhaps some of the subjective effects of the NDE.
And now this is some psychedelics are being legalized in Colorado. How do you feel about that? Because you've studied it, but in a laboratory setting, right?
Right. So our DMT studies occurred in a lab, and we didn't really have any therapeutic or spiritual intent. It was just characterize the effects.
Right.
And we really screened people carefully. We had to weed some people out. Even so, there was some negative effects from participation in the study. Thankfully temporarily. So we screened, we supervised, we weeded some people out, and even then there were some adverse effects. With the medicalization of psychedelics, which is taking place now, there is a tendency for researchers to glorify their positive effects and to minimize their negative ones. So it's not as that perspective isn't false, but it's a little misleading because the drugs are helpful, but in a very specialized kind of setting, or else survey studies indicate some benefit, but it's hard to really interpret those. And the adverse effects are referred to in not especially clinical or impressive terms. So the positive effects are being expanded or inflated, and the negative ones are being shrunk down. Some researchers are even suggesting putting the psychedelics into Schedule 4, which anybody could prescribe, like a nurse practitioner, a dentist, an orthopedist, a veterinarian, which seems a little irresponsible if you want to optimize the positive effects and you want to minimize the adverse effects.
Right.
If you go into your vet and you say, Fido has a rash, and by the way, can you give me a big dose of psilocybin? It could happen, and he'd give you a prescription, and you'd go home, and God knows what might happen. Or you give it to Fido, I guess. So I think as a result of this, medicalization, there is an impression that's being, grown that anybody could take these drugs in any kind of setting, and they shouldn't be illegal. There's a conflating of a couple of issues when you look at the move to decriminalize. Number one is that the drugs are helpful, and it is true to a certain extent. The other is that they occur in the natural world, things like psilocybin and DMT, and I guess ayahuasca as well.
Right.
Mescaline.
Right.
So it is true that these drugs can be helpful in certain contexts, and it is true that they're found in nature. But to conflate them and to almost recite them in the same breath, I think confuses two different issues.
And are you concerned that because the good stuff is being a little bit more focused on than the bad, that people might think that these are safer than they actually are? That's the fear?
Yeah, I think the risk would be casual use in a uncontrolled setting with a lot of distractions and complicating sorts of factors.
So let's walk through this. If someone does make the decision that they want to recreationally use, psychedelic, what would be kind of the checklist to go through to maximize the good and minimize the chances of something of a bad experience?
Well, there's quite a few, variables that, go into that. But I guess to, summarize them or to lump them into a few categories, first, know your source and your dose. You might want to start off with a low dose, and then next week or the next month, go a little higher. You wouldn't want to take a huge dose, especially if you're inexperienced.
And what is a low dose versus a high dose? I mean, just generally, or what are some, how is how is it even distributed when people are prescribing it? What is like a typical?
Well, what is currently being used both in Denver and in Oakland is mostly mushrooms.
Yeah.
So it would just depend on the purity and the strain and the
Right.
strength of the mushrooms. Usually, 5 grams of dried mushrooms of average strength is, considered a heroic, huge dose. So perhaps you might want to start with half a gram or
Right.
1 gram, and see how that goes. The other is idea, which is referred to as the set, which is your state of mind at the time, your emotional health, your physical health, what you've been eating, what you've been drinking, what you've been smoking. Your sleep, your mood. Like, are you in a bad mood or a good mood? Or, like if you're completely stressed out, that's not the time to experiment.
Wow. So if you're in a bad place, stay. Like if you're in a bad place mentally, then this shouldn't be the time to go on that journey.
Well, that's kind of a spectrum in a way. Like
Yeah.
if you're just a little stressed out and you have a problem that you're not able to solve on your own, and
Right.
you could use some extra insight, then I suppose that would be okay. But if you're in the middle of a divorce from a crazy abusive spouse and you feel threatened all the time and you're being stalked, that wouldn't be a good
Yeah.
scenario.
Yeah, might have some hallucinations there that wouldn't be so beneficial.
Right. So you have to be prepared.
Right.
Yeah, you have to be in a good place, relatively speaking.
Right. So dosage, amount, and source, and then set. And
Right,
what's
your
next?
state. Yeah,
Right.
and so the last part of that tripod, the set and the drug. The third part is what's referred to as the setting, which is the physical environment that you're taking the drug in. Usually, if you want the best effects and the most controlled environment, you would want to begin your traveling maybe in a comfortable room with friends.
How important is it to have someone who's experienced with these around?
Well, you would want them around for support. There are a couple different ways of using psychedelics. One is a more introspective way, which would be lying on a bed in a room, maybe listening to music through headphones and keeping your eyes closed, with eye shades. That would be an introspective kind of trip.
Right.
And you would want a friend around if you got anxious, to hold your hand, to ask a question to. The other is a more externally oriented kind of trip. You would be in a place of natural beauty, and you would keep your eyes open. You'd walk around, you'd interact with things. You might take some time out to lie down on the ground, but the experience would begin anyway, and the original intent would be to improve or to increase your appreciation,
Right.
To nature, of nature. And you would want friends around in that, kind of setting as well. Like if you get lost or disoriented or you're having an emotional response, you'd want to experience, people around. It's, I would say it's usually a good thing the first time to have an experienced person around, but for them to be straight, so they know the territory, but they're completely sober.
Right.
Yeah. That can be helpful. Or, some loved ones, maybe even, more than just one person.
Because, I read in your book that, there's been some instances where people, if it's bad and there's not someone there to help monitor them, that, even something like jumping off, I think, the top of a building was an example that you gave.
Yeah, one of my high school friends that I ran, track with in LA back in the day, was in Las Vegas and took a lot of LSD, was up on the, some like 10th floor, 20th, or 20th, floor of the hotel, and he was convinced that he could fly. Yeah, so he tried to fly out the window and crashed.
Oh my God.
Yeah, he died. So, you want people around. You want to start with a small dose. You want to be in a safe spot. You don't want to be on the 20th floor of Caesar's palace.
I mean, do you think that the stories that might have some sensationalist ability because they're so highly publicized when those things do happen, that's helped make it harder to develop actual research in this field because of the stereotypes that come from those kind of stories everyone knowing about instead of all the other things that have been positive from it?
Well, there are a couple of reasons that the studies were ended in the late, the late 1960s. One of them was the increasing amount of reports of really, terrible outcomes.
Right.
Which I think has been improved, militated in the last 50 years, 60 years, because of the more widespread knowledge about the proper set and setting. You wouldn't take a big dose of LSD the first time in a hotel. So the folk wisdom has matured, and so people are smarter now when they're taking psychedelics. The other is that researchers began to overextend. They began to overreach. They became messianic. Like Tim Leary would address tens of thousands of screaming fans, and encourage rebellion.
Wow.
Yeah. So that spooked people too.
Yeah.
It's important to learn from those mistakes. I think the main populace has learned how to take psychedelics to a lot greater extent than was the first wave of use. Researchers have by and large been sober. They've been keeping their heads about them. They're not going out on a limb calling for revolution. But there is a tendency, I think, even now, to make these drugs into something that they're really not. Like they're not saviors. They're a way to become more of who you would like to be. There isn't anything intrinsically healing or intrinsically harmful in psychedelics. It depends entirely on who you are and the context in which you're taking them, your intention and your experiences.
Right, and but these drugs have a really rich history with humans that I think it's overlooked a lot. I mean, just the idea of a vision quest, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
Which almost every ancient tradition has had in one form or another. The hero's journey almost always involves some kind of mind alteration at some point to come back and figure out who you are, right? It's maybe you could go through some different traditions that we forget about. I mean, the Native American one is certainly true. I know you've got experience with the Amazonian tribes as well, right?
Well, I spent some time with an ayahuasca using Brazilian church, one of the two legal ones in the U.S. But my knowledge of anthropology is pretty thin. But it is true that an altered state plays an important role in religions from the beginning. And I think to the extent that taking psychedelics can cause visions, then they're valued within that kind of setting. I don't think that the ideas of that religion came out of the blue from taking the psychedelic.
Right.
I think they worked on what was already there in the individuals in that culture. So if they, for example, believed that the sun was a god, then they would take a psychedelic and they'd be convinced that the sun was a god,
Right,
and
yeah.
they would expand on it, and they would come up with helpers of the sun, the relation between the moon and the sun. But it wouldn't be coming out of a complete vacuum. It wouldn't be like they the effects of the drugs are based on the interaction between the person and the drug. It isn't just the drug exerting an effect.
And I think you mentioned in your book that there's some people have different levels of these things in their body naturally, right?
Yeah, we still aren't able to measure levels of DMT in the blood with
Right.
any accuracy. So with the development of analyzing the genetic machinery involved in making the enzyme responsible for making DMT, we'll be able to fine-tune the mechanism more. Like are the genes more turned on in certain states or less turned on in certain states?
Right.
The paper I was describing that came out of Michigan a few months ago, demonstrated that levels of DMT in the rodent brain are as high as those of the more commonly known, neurotransmitters like serotonin and like
yeah.
dopamine. So I think we're beginning to tap into a DMT neurotransmitter system that's comparable to the serotonin system and the dopamine system. In which case, you'd wonder, what is the role of the DMT, neurotransmitter system?
Wow.
Most of the serotonin effects are things like mood.
Yeah.
For example.
So all this research is just starting to come forward. There might be an entire system that we didn't know about, and that might account for some of the spiritual experiences that we have. That's wild.
Well, I'm not certain if it would be the spiritual experiences, but one's conviction that the experiences are spiritual. One of the strongest, or one of the most striking descriptions of the DMT state from our volunteers was it really seemed real. They came back saying, this is as real as everyday reality, maybe even more real.
And in some cases, someone said realer than real.
Realer than real.
Yeah.
So if you're, thinking about, serotonin being responsible for mood, dopamine for pleasure, I wonder if the DMT neurotransmitter system, if it's discovered, is responsible for mediating our sense of reality.
Wow.
Which would be a very strange finding.
Yeah.
And I think, that is one of the reasons that, DMT is not in the news as much as, for example, psilocybin. A neurotransmitter responsible for mediating reality, sense is way weirder than psilocybin as the new antidepressant.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Why would our body, through evolution, why would we create DMT, right? Like, we understand serotonin and dopamine, and it makes sense, but
Right.
Why would we have this in our bodies?
Well, like we were talking about earlier, it may be regulating our sense of reality, which then kind of raises the question: well, what for, or why, or who? And you can really start going down a few rabbit holes. One of which is this is all a DMT-mediated hallucination that we're living in, and if that's the case, you have to consider, the implications. Like, we are living in the Matrix.
Yeah.
But we just don't have any other idea of how things are. We just have no idea. A friend of mine gets freaked out sometimes when she thinks about this world being a brain in a vat. Like this whole thing is generated in the brain and
Right.
has no basis in your so-called reality. But my response to her generally is, what difference does it make? We'll never know.
Yeah.
And in the meantime, we have to live our lives.
Yeah.
Yeah, which involves, cause and effect, good and evil, making choices, free will. Even though there's some thought, free will doesn't exist, it seems like we have free will. So that's a working assumption.
There's very interesting ideas about how, in some cases, people, when they are experiencing DMT, that it takes them into a different dimension. I mean, like, it's crazy. And that, you have some of these ideas that in some cases, maybe that people that have reported something, even like aliens or seen some of these, that throughout time, maybe there's some kind of connection between those two. I mean, I was just like reading this, like, what?
It's a very complicated set of issues. It isn't just one set of issues. Like as you mentioned, one of the common experiences people have on a big DMT trip is encountering what seem to be alien intelligences. We decided to call them beings, rather than aliens or entities. Beings seem like the most neutral term. But they take various shapes and forms, sizes, and they interact with the mind of the volunteer, and even sometimes with the mental representation of the body of the volunteer. So that occurred in at least half of our volunteers. And even if people didn't see a being or beings, they still felt the presence of an intelligence in that state. They might not have been able to have localized it, but it seemed full of information that was being downloaded, as it were, into the person. So if you want to just focus on the beings, you are obviously going to start thinking about alien abductions and encounters and the whole UFO literature.
But the idea here is that those encounters are occurring because people are being transported internally versus externally, right?
Yeah. I think when you're, when you're going to be discussing, the alien encounter on DMT, you'll need to distinguish between the two poles of the spectrum. One being, physical, contact with a being, and the other end of the spectrum would be just purely consciousness to consciousness. So if you're discussing DMT and the alien encounter, being encounter, you would be on the part of the spectrum of consciousness to consciousness exchange. So where does that consciousness reside? Is it in us, or is it outside of us in some parallel level of reality, or is it just a projection of our minds working through the biology of the brain? And I think there's a spectrum there too. I think in some people's cases, it's basically all about them.
Because what I found really fascinating was that some of these stories have parallels and they're not connected. The people aren't connected and they're having similar types of interactions with things. I mean, is that just, what explains that? That when they, some of these abduction DMT experiences, when similar things might be happening, I mean, how is that explained?
What do you mean, similar things happening?
Yeah, like when they say that they, for example, might have, and some of the negative ones where they might have been probed, or that the aliens, the beings rather, they looked similar, different people describing something similar things.
Yeah,
is what I'm saying.
Yeah,
which were not connected. The
yeah.
people were not actually doing these things at the same time. So it seems like just in general, like it just seems that that's a little, I don't know. I don't know. I just find it coincidental. Like.
Well, I think it reflects the presence of a limited number of garments that the mind can wrap ideas with in people. Like, for example, there's compassion, there's anger, there's sadness,
Right.
There's happiness, and those could be things that the brain is from the beginning generating, or it may be something that is being downloaded into the person to make them happy or sad. So in either case, the mind can only visualize a certain number of objects without, like, we can't see the far end of the light spectrum. Yeah, so it could be that our ability to imagine is also limited
Right.
on a spectrum.
And so the reason why there's these similarities, these commonalities between the experiences is simply because just as humans, we only have certain types of mindsets to be able to experience them, right? And so it's not like we don't have the language yet, maybe, to be more descriptive as to what's going on.
Yeah, I think it boils down to language.
Yeah.
Yeah, the greater your vocabulary,
Yeah.
the more you're able to perceive.
Yeah.
In that state where certain ideas or beings or insights or memories become visualized. You're able to apprehend them visually and interact with them in a way that you weren't before. So the language can be quite helpful. And that is actually one of the reasons I was drawn to the Hebrew Bible, is because it has a great language for understanding how to comprehend and benefit from divine visions, psychedelic visions.
Right.
There's a vocabulary. There's a vocabulary that has been developed. There are, in a way, protocols for understanding what's going on in the visions. There can be discussion between the being and you, and there's a certain way to begin that discussion and work it out. So when I was looking for a spiritual model, a religious model to explain certain aspects of the DMT effect, I was drawn to the Hebrew Bible's great vocabulary and almost a toolkit for being able to interact with a visionary state.
Wow, that's pretty wild.
Yeah, it kind of gets upon some hot button issues.
But I mean, if you do think about some of these religious experiences that people have been describing throughout, all the major religions that we have, the stories are widely known. I mean, It does involve. Some might argue hallucinations or very specific visions of things that weren't there previously, right?
Well, if you consider the beings to be a contemporary form of angels, then there's less of a split between a religious model and a scientific objective model.
I didn't even think about that.
Yeah, I think there are forces which are garbed,
right,
in a certain way that's culture and personality specific.
So really, you might have people that might think that the UFO people are crazy conspiracy theorists on one end, and then you've got these religious people that believe in angels and so forth, and you're saying that it all actually might be connected in some way. Maybe they believe in the same things without realizing it.
Right, and if that's the case, then people should start to exchange vocabulary.
Yeah.
So they can start to fine-tune what's going on in those states. For example, in the UFO community, and I'm not speaking as an expert, but you're not, it's not that impressive, the information that's being transmitted. It's kind of far out.
Yeah.
But is it helpful?
Yeah.
And the religious view of those altered states is more based on a more religious belief system, which focuses on God and on providence, the interaction between the divine and the material. So I think there can be a useful exchange between those two communities. Well, I think in general, the being encounter phenomenon in the DMT state is extremely interesting. There's a couple of.
It really is too when you see the art that you have in there to also describe to visualize some of these scenarios that are occurring, but how descriptive people were with the experiences. That's
right. Yeah. Well, we had the advantage of being in an incredibly controlled environment.
Yeah.
We gave the drug, it peaked in a couple of minutes.
Yeah.
They came down in, maybe 20, 30 minutes. And, then we just talked for an hour. And, we worked, hard to reconstruct their experience as carefully as possible. Yeah, so we got a lot of very valuable, detailed information. There's a couple of researchers right now looking at those bedside notes, to analyze them,
Right.
with some, mathematical tools.
Because, if it feels realer than real, as some people describe, and that's actually, that's an experience, that's going to impact, I think, the rest of your life, right?
Yeah,
If you're one of the people that went through that, it's just,
well,
it's hard to fathom.
Yeah, that's one of the hallmarks of a big, psychedelic trip. It isn't only our volunteers, but for most people, a big psychedelic experience is the most intense, significant experience of their whole lives. So if that's, and I would venture that's both true in a bad way and in a good way. So if it's a bad experience, it could mark you in the same sort of way. So that's the importance of making certain that you know what you're doing and you're
Right.
safe
Yeah,
and
yeah.
optimizing things.
Wow.
When you trip.
You were a visionary in many ways by doing these experiments long before they were popular, and now I'm sure it's very nice to be able to see that you're getting so much attention for your work. But what's next? What's the next chapter of this journey?
Yeah, well, it's been quite gratifying, and I really want to extend my gratitude to the group in Ann Arbor that first found DMT in the pineal, which turns out to not be the case, probably, but still they've been moving ahead, and they discovered DMT in the rat brain goes up during death. It may be a neurotransmitter. Yeah, and a number of other groups have continued with the DMT work, a German group, an English group. There's been a lot of ayahuasca research, and DMT is the visionary ingredient in ayahuasca. Lots of Spanish.
And ayahuasca is still quite popular in South America? Yeah?
Yeah, it's a combination of DMT and a plant that allows the
Right.
DMT to be orally active.
Right.
Yeah, and it originated in the Amazon. It's popular in Amazon, Latin America, increasingly in North America and Western Europe. Even Israel, there's ayahuasca happening in Israel,
Wow.
which is interesting.
Do you see a resurgence of these happening in the future?
Yeah, clearly there's more research which indicates that they're in a particular environment that they're safe and effective for certain conditions, and as a result of those studies, there's been a greater openness to decriminalization, legalization. So, yeah, I think when those two ordinances were passed in Denver and Oakland, they were in the national news.
Right.
So, people were saying, what are psychedelics? Yeah, so I think there's going to be...
Besides the Grateful Dead, I think maybe people don't have too much more to even reference.
Well, the Grateful Dead, Tim Leary.
Yeah.
Who else had about LSD? Richard Nixon.
Yeah.
Yeah, but, well, they're incredibly interesting drugs.
Yeah.
And they weren't being studied in humans for such a long time.
Right now it seems like, just in America especially, that with social media and technology, we're constantly surrounded by this instant gratification culture, this kind of, there's just things that we're doing all day, and it's really taking us away, I think, from this traditional idea of just of exploring the consciousness and what it means to be human, and a lot of the things that these experiences might be a part of. Do you see some kind of connection for desire of people to be seeking something, and your research?
I think those who are studying psychedelics and taking them are I think those people are by and large interested in becoming better people and making the world a better place. But to rely on psychedelics alone to become a better person and
Right.
make the world a better place, I don't think it's going to work, or it's going to take
Right.
a long time.
Right.
So What you need to do is provide fertile ground, as it were, for the for the psychedelics to work if you want to use them to enhance your personal growth or
Right.
make the world better. So that hinges on what you put in your mind, what you think about, what you read, what you talk about.
Do you follow quantum physics in this? And no.
Not that much. I mostly read the Bible.
Yeah.
And try to understand the text.
Yeah.
Because that's where I think, that's where I think it's at.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and that's just my idiosyncratic personal opinion.
Right.
But
What's your fascination with this? So
I don't know. It's just the way it makes me feel.
Yeah.
That's what it's boiled down to.
You feel like it provides answers that you're
Well, I mean,
some big questions.
it makes me feel good.
Yeah.
Like, man, this is tremendous.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I've been feeling that way since I started, peeking into it.
Yeah.
23 years ago now.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's really great intellectual fodder.
Yeah.
And it's quite moral and quite ethical in its perspective. It's how to be a better person and how to be a better member of society.
And that's, I imagine, why it's lasted so long.
That's one of the reasons it's lasted so long. And it's beautiful poetry.
Yeah.
I mean, the Psalms and
Psalms are
Isaiah.
beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so, one of my, theories is, that the Bible is a, text that was written under the influence of the prophetic experience. It recounts the prophetic experience as well, all of the prophets and all of those who experience visions in the text. So I think when you read certain things, that you resonate with the state of mind out of which those things were written. Like if you read the sutras, you'll get into a state of meditation of some sort, or you'll start to resonate with the mind of the composer of that sutra.
Right.
Yeah, and I think in the case of the Bible and the prophetic experience, you resonate with the mind of the prophet. So I think in a way it's like a taste or like a whiff of the prophetic state.
So what would you say are the biggest problems that we're facing right now as a society and as a species, in priority of threat?
Well, I mean, I think man lives from crisis to crisis. So I think, currently it's just that people aren't really getting along. So there's, and, there's no harm in getting along like inherently.
You just mean like general civility?
Yeah. So, but, nationally, internationally, getting along, I don't think it's inherently bad. I mean, it could be good. And it also helps the communal enterprise of humanity, which is all of our enterprise. So anything that advances that communal enterprise, I believe, is a good thing. So in my case, I mean, I've been, what have I been doing? Most recently, I just want to impart what I've learned about, whatever. I have a big library, and I've written books, and they're turning increasingly to certain ideas that I might have developed over the years from my studies and as a researcher. Yeah, I think the most cogent is the golden rule, which is to love your fellow as yourself. Yeah. Because incorporated into that version of the golden rule, it's much more altruistic, and also requires that you love yourself.
I think loving yourself is an interesting truth, that's going on right now. There's a lot of self-hatred.
If you hate yourself, I mean, you're pretty much behind the.
So what would you present as a possible solution to these? I mean, this is to getting along, to treating people the way that you want to be treated. And they are so simple, but they're it's not so easy to, right? And in society, I think, especially on a scalable level.
Yeah, well, I mean, there are all kinds of ways to feel better and be better. I mean, psychotherapy, I've been a firm advocate of that most of my life. So if you have psychological issues that might be amenable to a good psychotherapist, I mean, it can help. Prayer helps. Being a member of a religious community, if it's not, too neurotic, can help. Having friends. Study, I think, is really important, because if we're talking about altering, consciousness to advance the cause, then you want your consciousness to be, something that could benefit from a psychedelic experience. It was like what we were discussing earlier. Those studies of creativity worked with people that were already creative. They weren't just the man on the street. So if you want to improve the world and expatiate on that to the extent that would be provided by a well planned out psychedelic experience, you would want to be thinking things and reading things and discussing things that you want to expand and explore.
I think people will find your story very inspiring, because really what happened is that you had a belief in something that a lot of people were skeptic of a long time ago. You overcame an immense amount of challenges. Now people are looking at your research as, you're very much a pioneer in the field of this. How does that all feel?
Well, I mean, it's a tribute to a person and to a drug and to a state. I think it just kind of evolves. I mean, I'm more interested in getting out a particular message more than touting the existence or the potential benefits of a drug state.
Right.
Yeah. Other people are doing that now, which is great.
Right.
And the field will advance, and there'll be more uses, and more people will do better.
And the message is really the self-improvement.
Right. It's more spiritual, more nature appreciating, less depressed. Yeah.
Right.
And obviously there are going to be people and groups that use these drugs for bad purposes, but hopefully those news reports will be treated in a balanced manner.
I'm sure at some point in the future, when more textbooks come out that kids are going to be studying in school, if your name's on there somewhere in this new type of neurotransmitter as one of the pioneers of research, what would you want that to say?
I guess I would like to be known as the person who recharged or opened up the door to doing research in the U.S. again.
Right.
That's the main thing I contributed. At one level, I think also I proved, although it took me years to realize that,
right,
is that it's not inherently a useful drug.
Yeah.
It's just working on the person.
Right.
So somebody who wanted a near-death experience their whole life had a near-death trip.
Right.
Somebody who wanted a religious experience had enlightenment state.
Right.
Somebody who felt kind of awkward about her culture went to the Taj Mahal and danced. Yeah, so I think it's...
we have a lot more power than we imagine, right, as individuals.
It isn't entirely the drug.
Right.
The drug is just shedding a light,
right,
on steroids on the contents of the mind.
Thanks for listening, everybody. Don't forget to visit calltominds.com for recommended reading and relevant links. I'm David Donnelly, and this is A Call to Minds.